There are a lot of mistakes writers make. Some are easier to fix than others. Some aren't really mistakes at all, but some will peg you as an amateur and make your writing unreadable. I'm not talking about some world building mistake or an esoteric plot structure you might be using, but I am talking about something very basic, but incredibly overlooked. Point of view. And before you groan or claim that you understand POV, just give me a minute and I'll explain. Welcome back to the Wrestling with Words podcast. My name is Cameron. I'm a writer, an editor, and your host. Here, we talk about all things related to writing and storytelling. And the goal is to help you tell better stories while also understanding how the best stories are told. Point of view isn't necessarily a boring subject. It's actually probably one of the most interesting ones when it comes to writing and the elements of fiction. Your choice of point of view shapes how readers experience your characters' actions, emotions, and inner lives. Point of view isn't just a technical decision, it's a primary lens which your story is told through. Character, viewpoint, plot, and conflict are deeply intertwined, as is setting, tension, and even world building. The emotions and stakes you reveal depend on whose eyes and mind, depending on the type of point of view you choose. By consciously considering the point of view in your story, you control readers' empathy, dramatic tension, and the flow of information, which I think is one of the most important elements of storytelling. But there are two primary brackets that the conversation around point of view covers. The first one being who the story is about. This being the character and the character who is telling the story. And also the how we, the writers, are telling it. We often obsess over who our protagonist is, but how we tell their story determines what the audience feels, fears, and understands. Let's start with the who, but I want you to keep in the back of your mind that how we mentioned earlier. A good starting place to consider is to think about who the right character is to tell the story and recognize that this character is right for this specific story. Also, I am going to reference a lot from Orson Scott Card's book, Character and Viewpoint, and some other articles and resources that I will leave in the comments or in the notes down below. But first, who is telling the story? So we know that we want to write a story or that we have an idea or a concept in mind. Usually this can be a plot, maybe some kind of world building or an interesting concept, or maybe even a thematic dilemma. However, sometimes, and this might be the case for most of the time, the story idea comes to us in the form of a character. And this can be a good first step, but it can also be the first misleading step, because how do we decide who is going to tell this specific story? The first thing to consider is that the story might not actually be about this character, but it might be about another one. But why might this be the case? Or how might this be the case? Well, no matter the story, we need to consider where the conflict is going to be and who the best character is suited for either being involved in that conflict or observing it firsthand. Most of the time, the character who is facing the main brunt of that conflict will be the primary viewpoint character. However, what is sometimes the case is that we initially start with a project and we consider that this character is the character who we think the story is about. And it's true, it might actually be about them. This story is about them. But the conflict is elsewhere. If we have multiple point of view characters, this won't necessarily always be an issue, because we can use other viewpoint characters to facilitate the conflict while still progressing the plot to a point where the main character is the one who faces a good deal of conflict. But what does this look like in a story or in a book? This first example is where the main character isn't the one who has the most conflict happen to them. And the one that comes to mind is Dune by Frank Herbert. While Paul Atreides is the protagonist, the early chapters and even the first half of the book, we spend a considerable amount of time with Duke Leto, Lady Jessica, and even Gurney Halleck. Leto's arc in particular is tragic. He bears the political and strategic weight of House Atreides' downfall, while Paul is still largely growing into his role. This works because the conflict at the start belongs to Leto and Jessica more than Paul. Paul becomes central later, once he's matured into the full consequences of his family's actions. However, Dune is really about the fallout and effectiveness of Paul as a charismatic leader, especially in the later stories. He and his actions makes a great deal of the conflict happen around him through other characters. Dune is also written in the third person omniscient, where Paul is sort of the gravitational center point for the whole story. Fantasy often does a great job of rotating the responsibilities of conflict, sometimes being the default storytelling style. But the example I want to highlight is one of my favorite books and series, Hyperion by Dan Simmons. The novel is structured as a sci-fi Canterbury Tales where each pilgrim recounts their own story. Each POV illuminates a different aspect of the universe. The Shrike, the hegemony, the AI technocore, time travel, religion, war. Simons doesn't just rotate characters, he rotates tone, genre, and even voice. The conflict and thematic question, one of free will and suffering and sacrifice, are distributed across the entire cast, and each story recontextualizes the broader narrative. No single character could carry this burden alone, although there is sort of a standalone character in the final two books. The other thing we need to consider when it comes to who is telling the story is how this character relates to the audience. We can look at the flaws, the situations they are in, the changes they are going to experience, and their overall perspective as it relates to this conflict. How this might look will have massive implications on how your story is interpreted and the angle you might be exploring the conflict from. The Locked Tomb series by Tamsin Muir in Gideon the Ninth, the POV is tightly locked around Gideon's irreverent, sarcastic voice. It is deliberately stylized and a limited perspective, full of blind spots. The payoff of when her perspective is flipped in later books, where you get Harrow's fragmented, unreliable narration. This series is about the Ninth House, necromancy, and cosmic horror, but the point of view choices make it a character drama first. Had it been told omnisciently, it would have lost that claustrophobic emotional tension. There's also Children of Time, told in an alternating point of view between a human crew fleeing a dying Earth and a species of uplifted spiders evolving over a millennia. The spider point of view might sound bizarre, but it's deeply emotional and deeply compelling. Watching their civilization grow, paralleling, diverging from, and eventually surpassing humanity, lets the novel make huge philosophical and evolutionary claims without moralizing it. By balancing the point of view between us and the other, the book builds empathy where we least expect it. But in The Witcher Season 2, the Netflix series, Yennefer's arc, while the books and even Season 1 of the show used multiple point of views effectively, Season 2 focused heavily on Yennefer, placing her in a controversial redemption arc that alienated a significant portion of the fan base. Her betrayal of Ciri tied to a loss of magic doesn't feel earned to many viewers because her motivations were so thin and inconsistently portrayed in her point of view. The issue isn't that Yennefer is morally flawed, it's that her perspective is used to drive major plot shifts without the emotional grounding to really justify it, creating distance and even hostility from viewers. A better point of view balance, perhaps more time in Ciri or Geralt's head, might have softened the impact or at least made it so that this wasn't such a divisive plot choice. But in The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, the game is technically told from Link's point of view, but Link is mute and emotionally neutral. The emotional heart of the story is in Zelda's struggle with duty, fear of failure, and even isolation. It is only really revealed, though, through flashbacks or fragmented memories. I can't help but think or imagine if the game had occasionally shifted to Zelda's perspective during a key scene, as we did in The Last of Us Part 1. We went from playing as Joel to Ellie towards the end of the first game. Perhaps in Breath of the Wild, it could have added urgency and character motivation while maintaining Link's silence. The last major thing to consider when it comes to deciding who is going to be telling this story is what exactly does this character know or understand, and what is it that they don't know or don't understand. Here's where we can really both deepen the character audience relationship and set up plot twists and build tension. Being very aware of what your character or the character you're choosing knows about the setting, other characters, the conflict, and all of the other elements that might be present in your story will establish a very subtle partnership with your audience. And this is something that I tend to absolutely love. And if you've heard me talk enough, I talk a lot about this relationship, deciding whether the audience is learning something with the character or if the audience is learning something from the character. Because on a very meta level, a story is really all about eliciting emotions by controlling the flow of information. The way we reveal details about the plot and other characters can be controlled by the point of view we choose. Of course, point of view isn't just a lens on a character. It's a tool for controlling the structure of your story. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the book House of Leaves. On the surface, it's a story about a documentary that might not exist. But the deeper you go, the more fragmented the narrative becomes. Johnny editing Zampano's manuscript, which itself is analyzing footage no one can confirm is real. The result, though, is the story that becomes an architectural labyrinth of perspective. The novel doesn't just use point of view to tell a story, it uses point of view to sort of become the story. Message is you never truly know who's telling the truth, or if there even is a truth at all. But most stories don't need a labyrinth of typefaces and footnotes to succeed. They just need to understand whose eyes matter and how much truth those eyes can bear. Point of view can be used to enhance tone, emotional texture, or even world building. But let's take a step back. Obviously, point of view is all about the perspective the story is being told from, but it is also about how we are telling the story as well, or at least the mode in which the story is being told. There are 4 main or big types of point of view. I'm not going to go into tenses or anything else, just the main types of perspective. First person is told using I, me, and us as pronouns. Third person is told using he, she, them as pronouns. There's also third person limited, which is told from the perspective and eyes or mind of just one character at a time. There's also third person omniscient, which can be told from any character's eyes, perspective, or mind. But there are some rules to this. Omniscient isn't as popular nowadays. So make sure if you're going to use this, that you're having paragraph breaks, page breaks, or some other kind of breakage to avoid head hopping. And then, of course, there is the very rare, but still somewhat used, second person, told using you as pronouns. At a bare minimum, you should at least understand and recognize each of these types of points of view. A way to practice this is to take a step out of the written prose and see what sort of point of view and who the main point of view character is in a TV show or even a movie. This can sometimes be difficult, but typically a director will have a certain perspective that the story is being told through. But bringing it back to what matters most, what a character sees, feels, and even hides, because ultimately, point of view isn't just what's viable on the page. It's what your audience is allowed to feel. It's what you are allowing your audience to feel. And each of these points of view offers different benefits and have their own drawbacks. First person, which is probably the most popular through all genres and types of fiction, gives a more intimate and immersive experience with a character, while also tailoring the narrative to that character's voice. However, usually we limit the story to just one character's first person point of view. Third person limited, which is most common for science fiction and fantasy, and probably the second most popular in general, allows you to experience the story through many different characters' perspectives, letting the universal narrator control the point of view lens. Here you can open the aperture, so to speak, of your story and broaden the cast and scope, while still letting the main POV character offer their thoughts and perspectives come out onto the page. And I'll keep it limited to just that. Getting into the technical nature of second person and even third person omniscient is they're just less common when it comes to narrative decisions. If you're not as familiar with writing point of view, the universal advice is to stick to either first or third limited. Doing crazy things with point of view, unless you really have a grasp on writing point of view, is usually not advised. This is probably the number one thing that turns off the most editors and agents to submitted works or manuscripts. And here's the thing. Point of view is probably the thing that has the biggest influence on your story. How can your amazing character be compelling if they aren't the character best suited for this story? If they aren't the character who's faced with the bulk of the action or offer a unique perspective on the action or even world and other characters around them, are they even the main character? How can we be immersed in a scene and feel the tension if we are constantly head hopping from one character to another, breaking every rule with flagrant regard, when this hasn't even been established in our story? Point of view becomes so entrenched in how we tell a story that if every other element of the story is perfect and the point of view is broken or off, it becomes unreadable. If the setting is a bit inconsistent, a character or the side characters are weak, or the themes and plot feel tropey, a story can still be enjoyable and even compelling if the point of view is told in a correct way. But if point of view is broken, then that whole thing falls apart. It's very easy to focus on the fun and cool skills or techniques like world building, character design, plots, and deep thematic concepts. But when it comes to point of view, we often sideline this element of fiction, almost taking it for granted. So how does point of view influence your story? Aside from being the central point from which your audience sees the story through, it is also what determines how and who is going to be telling your story. And really consider this, because who changes the entire perspective and outlook on your world and the other characters. It impacts the arc of the story and the point of reference for the audience. But also determining how to tell your story will affect the pacing, plot twists, and the flow of information, the tension, dramatic irony, and so many other of the fibers within your story. The biggest mistake that I see, not just with new writers, but seasoned writers as well, is made getting this wrong. Is either not understanding who should be telling this story, but also how they should be writing it. If you understand this, then you'll be putting yourself leagues ahead of all the other writers. But let me know what you think. What are your thoughts on point of view? Is this something that you have a good grasp on, or is there something else that you think is important about writing point of view? I'm curious to hear what you all think. This was a question that I sort of posed in a past live stream as well as in the community section through a poll. Special thank you to the channel members and to my subscribers over on Substack. If you want to support the channel more, feel free to check those out. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.